why don't you give us a quick overview of what's happened here in Virginia? There's been some pretty significant developments just this week out of the governor's mansion here in Virginia.
Yeah, so Governor Youngkin, he played this pretty close to the ever-present vest over the course of the session, right? He was asked numerous occasions, what are you going to do with all these bills that the Democrats are advancing? And his spokesperson said, well, the governor said during the State of the State address that Virginia has some of the toughest gun laws in the country, but we'll take a look at, these bills as they get here. So the governor ended up vetoing 30 bills, according to his office. Now, some of these are kind of duplicates, same House and Senate version, but different bill numbers. He amended 6 of them. Virginia is kind of a unique animal in terms of, what the powers of the governor are. So he can take a bill and say, you know what, I will sign it if you make these changes. And he'll send it back to the legislature. If the legislature makes those changes, then the bill becomes law. If they don't make those changes, then the bill is defeated. He did that with a half dozen bills, and then he signed 2 of the most uncontroversial bills that were adopted by Democrats. These were bills that I think had at least a handful of Republican supporters as well.
Right. And so it was a lot of activity, right? I mean, that's one of the big takeaways, I think, in a state like Virginia, where we've got a Republican governor and we have Democrats in control of both houses of the state house, of the legislature, but only by the thinnest of margins. Mm-hmm. It is interesting to see how much action there has been on this issue. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just the fact, even if we're talking about, House and Senate versions of the same bill, we're talking about more than a dozen, right? Probably a dozen and a half substantive gun control measures, everything from waiting periods to, changes to the red flag laws to bans on so-called assault weapons. Those were all sent to Governor Youngkin's desk. And then you look at states like New Mexico, where, Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham had a very expansive gun control agenda, right? She wanted a 14 business day waiting period. She wanted all kinds of new gun-free zones. And I think the Democrat majority in Santa Fe gave her 2 gun bills. They gave her a 7-day waiting period with concealed carry holders exempt. They banned open carry of firearms around polling places, but again, concealed carry holders were exempt. You can look at what Jay Inslee signed into law in Washington State this week. Again, just 2 or 3 bills, all of them sort of watered down. Even in Colorado, where they're, advancing sensitive places bills, they are prepared to bring a quote unquote assault weapons ban to the floor of the House. All of those measures have been heavily amended and I would say watered down, right? Scaled back substantially. We didn't see that in Virginia. There were, maybe some minor tweaks to these gun bills, but they were adopted largely along party lines and in their, high test form, right? These are the types of bills that you see pass in Sacramento and in Albany and in Boston and in Annapolis, not the type of bills that generally go anywhere in Virginia. And again, even more expansive and more intrusive than what we've seen in a lot of states that are Democrat controlled this year.
Yeah. And to me, I don't know that we've seen any state that's been this active on the issue too. Like, there's interesting points to pull here from what the legislation was and how far it went. And then also just the sheer volume of it. I don't even think California has passed this many pieces of gun legislation through their legislature. Now, ultimately, you're not going to have that end effect. And this is one of the reasons we haven't covered it as closely here at the Reload, I think, is because it's, I think it wasn't clear, like you said, Youngkin wasn't out there talking a lot about it, but the sources that I'd spoken with and his office had given out the position that you mentioned earlier, but the sources I'd spoke with thought he's going to veto most of these, if not all of them. And so in the end of it, not much is going to change for Virginians on gun law. So that's, the practical side is not a huge difference there. But I really think the political side of this is what fascinates me, right? Because, you have so much volume, so many gun bills after Democrats, they had a slightly better than expected election in 2023. Not, they retook control of the legislature by
Mhm.
thin margins. People thought
One
maybe
vote in each
right.
chamber. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the other remarkable thing about all this is like the Democrats stayed together so well on these issues.
Yeah.
And you didn't have dissenters on any of them. That's one of the remarkable things to me is like, it's not just that you got a couple of gun bills through, it's that they got all of them through, all on almost exclusively party line, which meant they couldn't lose a single person in either chamber. And they didn't, even on some of the most aggressive bills that you mentioned there, the assault weapons ban. They've got, waiting periods. They'd made all kinds of changes to the concealed carry policies in Virginia. They would have made it much harder to get a permit because they removed a number of ways you can satisfy the training requirements, including getting rid of NRA and USCCA certification as an option, taking those classes. They would have eliminated a lot of the reciprocity deals that Virginia has with other states, which would have made the permit a lot less useful. So these are like practical negative things for a lot of people in Virginia, presumably including some of the constituents for some of these Democrats in more moderate areas. And so what do you make of that? It's kind of fascinating.
It is fascinating. It's also somewhat terrifying as a Virginia gun owner, right? To know that I think of the Truth About Guns at a story today called the Thin Red Line in Virginia. Again, Governor Youngkin is the sole backstop right now, right? Preventing these things from being enacted into law. And, you compare this to just a couple of years ago, right? When Democrats took control of the state legislature, they had the governorship in 2019, right? In the November 2019 election. So 2020 comes around just before, COVID hits and disrupts everything.
It was like the last big political story before.
It really was, right? And that was when, we started hearing, okay, we're going to run a assault weapon ban. And Northam's talking about confiscation, right? Mm-hmm. You're not going to be allowed to possess the guns that you currently have. That was when we saw in January of 2020, somewhere between 30 and 50,000 gun owners show up in downtown Richmond for the VCDL Lobby Day rally. Just, thronged downtown Richmond in a show of force, saying, listen, we're not going to stand for this. We object to this.
And that was after that very successable Second Amendment sanctuary movement where you saw,
I think it was in the midst of it. Yeah, I think it was still going on at that point. By the time the rally took place, probably the bulk of the counties and cities in Virginia that adopted those resolutions had done so. But I think there were still, some meetings that were taking place. But yeah, I mean, I was covering those events and those meetings in December, early January, and then the rally took place, I think, mid-January, because I went from the rally to the airport to go out to SHOT Show. So I remember that was sort of the timing of it. But, even then, just a few years ago, you had Democrats like Senator Craig Deeds, who were the primary roadblock to Democrats passing that gun ban. He said at the time, he wasn't necessarily opposed to the idea of banning guns in theory, right? But he didn't like that bill. Well, he sure liked this year's bill because he signed on as a co-sponsor. And as you say, Deeds, who represented a fairly rural part of Virginia, he got redistricted and ended up moving to Charlottesville and ran for re-election in a very safe blue district. And because of that, he doesn't have to worry about representing rural gun owners anymore, right? I think there are still plenty of gun owners in Charlottesville who he should keep in mind. But now Deeds is now just a, cut and dried standard anti-gun Democrat. And as you say, that is the case for the entirety of the caucus. There are no, blue dog Democrats in Virginia in the legislature, at least when it comes to guns. They are in lockstep. And they're in line with the Kathy Hochul's of the world, the Gavin Newsoms of the world, some of the most, ardent gun control supporters. And you're right. I think it is interesting I wonder if that would change if there was a Democratic governor. Would they still have gone as aggressively as they did? Or was some of this, sort of political performance art, right? Knowing, okay, well, I can vote for this and I don't actually have to live with the consequences because I'm pretty sure Youngkin's going to veto it. That might have, been on the minds of some of these lawmakers, but I mean, I'll say as a gun owner in Virginia, I can't count on that to be the case, right? We only have their votes to go on. That's their record. And what the record shows this year is that there are no moderates when it comes to gun control on the left side of the aisle in Richmond.